Welcome to Video in Context, a unique course and lecture series which is funded by the Kramlich Foundation, in which I have the pleasure of co-teaching with Professor Jackson, who's with us in the front. And today we have a special guest lecture by Ken Ueno, who is a professor at UC Berkeley. And this guest lecture is going to talk about sound and image and the rich relationships that sound and image can have, but also, of course, Ken's unique work with sound, which I will introduce now. Professor Ken Ueno is a renowned sound artist and a producer of music and a professor of music at UC Berkeley with an impressive background in classical music, contemporary composition, and extended vocal techniques. Ueno has gained a reputation for pushing the boundaries of sound and performance. And remember, the lecture we had on Tuesday was titled Hard to Hear, so that includes the notion that some sounds feel like noise, but Professor Ken Ueno will explain maybe what the difference is between sound and noise, and how noise sometimes can become sound and even music because we learn to listen to it. His work has been described in both as both innovative and thought-provoking, blending traditional instruments with electronic and unconventional sound sources. In his upcoming talk about sound art, Ueno will share his insights and experiences producing music for a variety of contexts, discussing the intersection of music, technology, and creativity. Professor Ken Ueno is a highly accomplished musician and sound artist whose work spans a variety of genres and mediums. Born in New York City, he began his musical training on the violin and piano, eventually switching to voice and composition. He holds degrees from Boston University, the New England Conservatory, and Harvard University, where he earned a PhD in music composition. As a performer, Ueno is known for his unique vocal abilities and the use of extended techniques, including throat singing, overtone singing, and multiphonics. He has performed with some of the world's leading ensembles, including the San Francisco Symphony, the Boston Modern Orchestra Project, and the Italia Ensemble. As a composer, Ueno has been recognized with numerous awards and commissions, including the Rome Prize, the Paris Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and the From Music Foundation Commission. His music has been performed at major festivals and venues around the world, including Carnegie Hall, the Venice Biennale, Tanglewood Music Center, and most recently the Brooklyn Academy of Music, with a wonderful piece that I hope he will share with us. Ueno has also made significant contributions to the field of sound art, exploring the use of technology and unconventional sound sources in his work. He has collaborated with visual artists, with architects, and with scientists to create immersive installations and performances that engage all the senses. A recent performance in Hong Kong included a collaboration with a small army of drones and fences, which was very impressive and indeed very immersive. Overall, Ken Ueno's career is characterized by his innovative and interdisciplinary approach to music and sound art and his commitment to exploring new possibilities for artistic expression. One of his quotes that I love the most is, he likes to say, "The weirder I am, the more hope there is for you." And so with that, please welcome Professor Ken Ueno.
Great. Thank you so much. Nice to be here. Thank you, Greg and Shannon, for inviting me to speak on this series. The luminaries you have on this series is amazing. I'm humbled, and it's a great honor to be included. Thank you. I would like to start by showing you a short video of a musical performance of mine. My comments thereafter will serve as a brief introduction to my performance practice. Sir, would you like to sit down? Okay. Breath is at the ontological center of my art practice as a vocalist, and taking a cue from the poet Robert Haas's thesis that poetry is a physical structure of the actual breath of a given emotion. My practice transposes this notion into music through physical valence. I believe that physical gestures are indeed mapped to given emotions. When we hear the operatic tenor Pavarotti sing a high C and linger there for tens of seconds, he not only suspends his breath, but we too, as listeners, suspend our breath. Physiovalence directs our bodies to vivify in real time the suspension of our breath in parallel with the music to which we are listening. In my music, through circular breathing, that Pavarottian lingering moment is expanded to minutes, not seconds. The phenomenological reading of that expanded lingering exacerbates traditional modes of analysis in terms of structural hearing. For example, in Tard, the video of which we just watched, I hold my breath in a bowl of water for 2 minutes as an analog to how I have felt my breath has been suspended since November 2016, as well as how I feel my voice as a person of color has been muted. I am the hunger artist. I risk my life on stage as entertainment for a largely white audience. As a form of protest against the underlying premise of being of Asian descent in America, invisibility, I am asking, how close to death do I need to come? What do I need to do for you to hear me? What do I need to do to not be invisible? As opposed to a piece of music constructed from traditional musical material, the Soma aesthetic focus on the body directly targets the locus of trauma, as Resmaa Menakem says, white body supremacy, and the trauma that causes and perpetuates it lives primarily in the body, not the thinking brain. My piece foregrounds my body as a specific instrument. Much of my music is person-specific, wherein the intricacies of performance practice are brought into focus in the technical achievements of a specific individual fused inextricably with that performer's aura. In an era in which we are increasingly rendered anonymous through digitization, person specificity stands against the normative business practice of neo-colonial transportability in classical music and says, no, you cannot replace people who look like me. I teach a course at Cal called Radical Listening, a breath requirement fulfilling arts course which considers music through the lenses of extra-musical epistemologies, aesthetics, philosophies related to culture, memory, identity, gender, etc., with a purview that listening to music enhanced with such considerations can foster and illuminate personal emotional stakes. Cultivating personal stakes in listening has the benefit of moving us towards a greater capacity for empathy. What we do in our most personal aesthetical spaces can project outwards into how we engage with others publicly as caring citizens. Tactically, we rehearse applying radical listening concepts in listening to some of the most ubiquitous and influential music in Western culture, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Stevie Wonder, Celine Dion, Missy Elliott, David Bowie, Kanye West, in tandem with exponents of experimental music and new trends, for example, Vocaloids. One of the adjacent epistemologies I cover in my class has helped me theorize and unpack what I do as a performer. Roland Barthes' concept of the pheno song and geno song introduced in his celebrated 1972 essay, The Grain of the Voice. The pheno song is all of the features which belong to the structure of the language being sung, the rules of the genre, the coded form of the melisma, the composer's idiolect, the style of interpretation, in short, everything in the performance which is in the service of communication, representation, expression, everything which is customary to talk about, which forms the tissue of cultural values. The geno song is the volume of the singing and speaking voice, the space where significations germinate from as signifying play, having nothing to do with communication, representation of feelings, expression. The geno song, the grain of the voice, is the materiality of the body speaking its mother tongue. The notion of geno song, the materiality of the body, influenced me toward theorizing about what I call physiovalence in my practice, the sympathetic resonance in alignment with broadcast viscerality in performance as received and acted upon the audience. To operate, a work needs to be given an appropriate temporality of engagement with the audience long enough that the physical state and by extension the mental state of the audience might empathically align with the artwork's intent. But more than that, the consideration that what the body does itself, not as a carrier or broadcaster of semantic meaning, but what its presence itself and what it can broadcast along with it or in spite of its historical charge to serve the delivery of semantic meaning is profound. Barthes' realization resonates with what our esteemed colleague, the poet and Cal professor Robert Haas, has said of poetry, that poetry is a physical structure of the actual breath of a given emotion, that there are words and there is the choreography and breath, the physical structure that operates on our bodies. He says further, I've come to think that the physical sensation, even if we read it silently, the mental equivalent of the physical sensation of the rhythms of a poem get planted in us far more deeply than any ideas we may come to have about its meaning. Martin Jay, the eminent emeritus professor here at Cal, introduced me to the field of soma aesthetics in his essay, The Soma Aesthetics of Sound, where he unpacks my performance practice through soma aesthetics. He says, soma, the Latin word for body, is used to stress the interpretation of mind and flesh rather than the passivity of the body that is merely there to be formed by spirit. Rather than contemplating objects from afar, assuming a position of elevated disinterestedness, soma aesthetics involves an experiential unification of subject and object in a moment of bodily intensity, as often painful as pleasurable, in the place of an eternity of formal, cold beauty. Rather than upholding the autonomy of art for its own sake, it abets in the invigoration of life by art, a project foreshadowed in many avant-garde practices in movements like Dada and Surrealism. Rather than identifying art with organic wholeness and sublimated balance, it expands it to include the fragment, interrupted and incomplete. So, Barthes' Geno song, Haas's physical structure of the actual breath of a given emotion, and Soma aesthetics. I have been collecting discourses in the ways the body delivers presence and communicates in ways that are hypersemantic, or in parallel to the thing to which we are attending at the moment. In Barthes, Grain of the Voice, he's attending to the sung voice. In Haas, poetry. I want to posit that these parallel hypersemantic modalities are clues to why we have, continue to have, and in fact need music and poetry. Music and poetry expresses what we cannot through prose. This fact is also an analysis of our human capacity for communication and exchange. We are wired to be sensitive to multiple modalities of communication. I want to now turn to P. Adams Sitney, the Vasari of American experimental cinema. In Eyes Upside Down, he introduces the notion of somatic cinema in his analysis of Mary Mencken's works, relating her works to the grand Whitmanesque tradition of centering the body. Soma aesthetics was, after all, invented by an American philosopher, Richard Schusterman, whose mission it is to destabilize the prestige of continental philosophy and upholding what he thinks to be an essential Americanness. Soma aesthetics recouples and recenters the body as a site for aesthetic consideration, counter to the history of aesthetics, a subfield of philosophy invented by a German philosopher, Alexander Baumgarten, who, following Neoplatonist and Christian tradition, decoupled the body from aesthetic consideration. That which is of the mind is holy, that which is of the body is a site for sin. P. Adams Sitney, in Eyes Upside Down, says of Mary Mencken's work, there's actually a more profound inflection that could be traced back to Walt Whitman as the visionary child in motion, going forth each day. For a central element in the stylistics of the American avant-garde cinema is the handheld camera. Although that term is somewhat misleading in this context, perhaps the walking camera or the somatic camera might more vividly convey the identification of the mobile frame of the ultimately projected image with the movements of the filmmaker. Mary Mencken pioneered the radical transformation of the handheld somatic camera into a formal matrix that would underpin an entire work in the films. Adams cites Stan Brackage's complimentary assessment of Mencken's accomplishment. Mary Mencken's open sesame to me was that Visual Variations on Noguchi was the first film I had ever seen which completely not only admitted but capitalized on the fact that the camera was handheld. This was, in one sense, a very simple contribution by Marie, but it led me to begin questioning the entire reality of the motion picture image as related to the way or ways of seeing. Okay, so here's a bit of Mary Mencken's Variations on Noguchi. Here. So she's moving the camera, curate her vision around Noguchi sculpture. Okay. All right, and then here's some examples from her Glimpse of the Garden, which also shows the somatic camera. You can feel her body moving around the garden. It's quite physical. back. Once we consider camera movements as choreography, then we consider the film as calligraphy. The somatic aspect in these films communicates in a way associated with the way I experience Fino's song, as well as what Haas says about the physical structure of poetry, the way I feel poetry in my mouth when I say La gloriosa donna della mia mente, the perfectly calibrated modulation between consonants and vowels which Dante crafted to flow so mellifluously. It is a musical orchestration. It is an intervention into the Italian language itself. If you've ever tried to read a conference paper in Italian, you'd know, given its propensity for consecutive vowel sequences, unskilled attempts at Italian writing tend to feel in the mouth like something between an opera warm-up exercise and a Neapolitan traffic jam. P. Adams's revelation transformed the way I absorb cinema. After P, I feel cinema somatically. It introduced me to the transparent subjectivity and the presence of the body behind the camera. This stands in contrast to the dominant culture of cinema technique in Hollywood, which is what Martin Scorsese calls the invisible hand. In mainstream films, films are made in a way to least call attention to itself as a medium in order to privilege the storytelling. Such a hierarchy is true in music too. We are mainly trained by society and conservatories to attend to the melody, the words of the songs. In all of the poetry classes I had ever taken as a student, I remember mostly arguing about the meaning of the words. I never got to take a class by Robert Haas. Let me try another analogy. In Hollywood films, the medium is in service of the story in the way that older paintings represented a person or thing. Whereas in abstract expressionist paintings, the painting itself is the subject. In the transparent subjectivity of a Jackson Pollock, we can trace his physical movements. Pollock's body as a medium of affordances and constraints, a document of his bodily motions as choreography. That viscerality projects a thing that only it can. Okay, and now I would like to show you an original work, a collaboration of mine with the experimental animator Harvey Goldman. The inspiration for this film is the fantasy that cultural memory might reside in even the most quotidian of everyday phenomena, such as soap bubbles, where mythological battles and scenes are replayed constantly. Somewhere in the statistical noise of soap bubbles is the din of battle. In creating this piece, I started by recording long takes of myself performing gestures with soap bubbles, as well as blowing into a cup with a straw. I then selected some of the more complex gestures, which I hoped would help create richness in terms of levels of referentiality to the original sound sources as recognizable phenomena, in order that there will be a range between sound sources presented as raw materials as being recognizable to their original states, to sound sources presented untreated but more abstract, more electronic-like. Next, these sounds were spectrally convolved with sounds of warfare. Working with samples of bubbles ensured a rich harmonic spectrum, which is conducive to convolution. Then these sounds were granulated and spectrally filtered with Maximus P, an object-based coding environment for working with sounds. When I recorded the soap bubble gestures, I realized that the sounds were so subtle that I had to have the microphone close and the gain up. This meant that for much of the recording, as I performed the bubble gestures, I had to hold my breath. A recording is also an orchestration, an instrument, as well as a performance. So I'll play a little bit of this from the very beginning. when I hear this now, I feel something of Mencken's somatic camera, but transposed to the microphone. I want to now show you an early attempt at somatic film. See you later, Greg. Thanks. In Rome, there's a set of 28 marble steps called the Santa Scala. On top of the stairs is a church dedicated to St. Lawrence. The tradition is that one can only ascend the stairs on one's knees, as it is believed that these stairs are the very stairs leading to the praetorium of the Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. It is believed that these are the stairs that Jesus climbed on his way to his trial. Looking at this old video from 11 years ago, I am struck by the creaking of the wood panels covering the marble stairs. The stairs are so holy that they are shielded from even our knees. So many Americans, you can tell by their jeans and sneakers, and it's kind of funny. I unintentionally mostly documented the butts of the faithful. Not being a Catholic, I wanted to experience this esoteric ritual of faith. The equation seems to be the more physically taxing an act of faith, then you are more pious. That the duress on our body is a currency of faith. The overriding symbol of sacrifice in Catholicism, of course, is this crucifixion. So a scale of pain duress relative to that ultimate physical horizon becomes a measure of our faith. Temporality is a measure too. Notice how slowly the more devout climb the stairs, as they take more time praying. In contrast, me, as a heathen, I am playing Frogger between the faithful tourists. An epiphanic form, the payoff, is the church of St. Lawrence at the top of the stairs, as well as a view down to the stairs, the faithful waiting in line to ascend. It was an earnest attempt for me at empathy. I wanted to feel something about what they were experiencing. Show you what happens at the top. That's a glimpse of the church up top. Come up. And then a little view down. Can't help that, right? It's always present. Neoliberalism is all, it's like the air, right? This too is water. I am a heathen, but I believe in art, and my pope is P. Adams Sitney. I am lucky to call him friend and mentor. P. introduced me to Tenemos, and here we are at Tenemos. There are people on this lecture series, Susan Oxtoby and Kate McKay, who can speak much more knowledgeably about Tenemos than I can, but let me give a little Cliff Notes version. Towards the end of his life, the American experimental filmmaker Gregory Markopoulos was working on his grand epic, an 80-hour cycle called Eniaios, meaning both unity and uniqueness. He determined that the film should only be screened at a sacred site, Temenos. And after he passed away, his partner, Robert Beavers, has been organizing screenings of 10-hour segments of the cycle every 4 years in a secluded plain in the middle of Greece. It takes Beavers and his team about 4 years to fundraise and edit about 10 hours of Eniaios by hand. I was not able to make it to the COVID-delayed screenings of Tenemos this past summer, but 6 years ago, I was there. The Temenos is an art pilgrimage. It is the sacred space of screening of Eniaios, as well as the event. I flew to Greece. I took a 4-hour bus ride to Lyceria, a village high in the mountains of Arcadia, where we stayed. Every night we had dinner early, then took a bus for an hour to an even more remote place in the hills, and then hiked for 30 minutes until we reached the open field, Temenos. We waited until it was dark enough to screen the films. The 10 hours of the Eniaios segment was broken up over 3 nights. The scale of the screenings over that grain of time was profound. 10 hours over a long weekend was long enough that it was hard to parse lived life from screening time, if that makes sense. Especially since the screening experience features the foregrounding of so much of what P. Adams calls epiphenomena. Eniaios is silent. Bright white flashes that flicker rhythmically to the meter of ancient Greek poetry, alternating with blackness and a few scenes. When the flashes are gone for durations that are just as poetically profound, what lingers are after images in pink and green within our eyes, our minds. What can be more somatic than this? The film literally screens within our bodies. Every once in a while, a bird would fly dangerously close in front of the projector, nature's intervention, complicating the hypermeter, and later in the evening, this being Greece in the summer, the stars grow brighter and brighter. And later still, I saw multiple shooting stars. The extreme austerity of the film somehow facilitated its embrace with the epiphenomena, the birds and stars and shooting stars, everything around the skin of the film, as if Markopoulos had calculated that they would happen. The film orchestrationally resonates with Temenos as place. Temenos is a temporally specific somatic ritual. My work is somatic, but in the videos I've been striving also to capture what I feel to be visually compelling. Here is a more recent example. Breath is at the ontological center of my art practice. I filmed this while snorkeling in Cozumel. It captures a granular quality, a complexity of texture that I am drawn to, with a play of natural light, the blue of water. There's another aspect, the somatic aspect, that is important to me. Since I was snorkeling, I was holding my breath. And what's more, the bubbles you see are the slowly rising exhalations of scuba divers below me. This is evidence of life. I was trying to take as much footage as I could in a way to avoid showing the scuba divers, and then left a trace of their bodies without showing their bodies, which I find more poetic. I wanted to capture the beautiful without didactically resolving the scene, crudely saying what it is. In Mary Mencken's somatic films, the camera is swung while she walks. I am snorkeling and holding my breath. The physical stakes are higher. Temporality is also important here. I had to be there during that time of year, during that time of day, so that the water was clear and the light had this right quality. A meridian is an architectural clock, a hole in the ceiling or wall that allows a beam of sunlight to beam down to the section of the floor. The light shines on a line marked with the dates of the year. The natural feature that the angle of the sun changes each day is leveraged into a sublime architectural feature, a calendar on the floor tracked by sunlight. My bed is a library. I remember reading on my bed one day when I noticed a shaft of afternoon light sneaking through a small gap in my Venetian blinds. The light landed like a spotlight on the binder of a book on my bookshelf, highlighting the name of a favorite author. It felt providential. It was then that I realized that all points on the earth are meridians, and as we traverse the world, there are opportunities to take notice of phenomena made more beautiful with the confluence of light hitting it in this way, secret meridians. Okay. Here's an example of one of my secret meridians. I like that I had to be there when the flower was blooming, precisely at the moment the angle of the sun's ray hit the back of the flower. The confluence of these complex trajectories of time and place is what I call a secret meridian. The Cozumel bubbles, as they depended on the current and light conditions, as well as the happenstance of the divers being below, is also a secret meridian. My Instagram feed is an archive of how I live my everyday life, employing these strategies in documenting the quotidian sublime. For example, I took this next video on a recent trip to Switzerland in December with CERN. Quiet and observational, but this too was rather physical, a task to film. It was Switzerland in December. It was cold, but I had to be there and the temperature just so and the wind just so that the light decoration on top of a restaurant ship would reflect in this way on the water, a way that it looks animated. But given the physics of the waves of the water and the light, it showcases the beautiful complexity of organic life. Dare I say that I like this better than CGI? Added to these parameters are the human, narrative aspects centered around my body, holding and performing the somatic camera. Pain and sacrifice are ritualistic offerings of the daily practice, but there are also affordances of failure in misusing the camera. Okay, and then I have a little spiel up here. So one of the things that I like to do is take these instruments, like these flip cameras, and play with them until I can figure out ways to make it do things it normally doesn't. Some distortion or refraction of light. And then these artifacts sometimes can be quite beautiful. And that's some of the ways that I like to play with musical instruments, and kind of tweak it, make it produce sounds, do things that are a little bit more unusual, because in the artifacts there are some hidden beauties that are usually denied or filtered out from the world. Some 20 years ago, in some early electronic works of mine, I punched holes and applied tape to CD surfaces to purposely make them misread and articulate artifacts, glitches, and bleeps. What I surprisingly discovered was that artifacts of different CD players sounded differently. It was then that I realized that it is when a machine or system fails that we hear the true intrinsic voice of the machine or system. Most of the time, we filter out the intrinsic voice of the body. In the current social climate of the United States, we are bearing witness to the intrinsic voice of the broken system. Here's a short video in which all I did was walk slowly towards a Gerhard Richter painting at the Tate Modern. Did you see the color change? This is an analysis of the software that calibrates color within the iPhone. But used in this way, it is a kind of time travel qua art analysis. The iPhone reveals the layers of paint underneath the outer green surface. It also reveals how technologically mediated experiences are always a pharmacon. Pharmacon, an ancient Greek word invoked by Derrida via Plato, a word that means two things at the same time, poison and medicine. So even with the latest technology, the colors are not as they seem in real life. The mediation is always an orchestration that adds its own trace, never innocent. When the digital camera or the iPhone, quote unquote, fails, the trace of its mediation is foregrounded. The Scorsesian invisible hand is given up from behind the screen of the wizard, and transparent subjectivity is achieved. When the intrinsic voice of the machine is revealed, we not only have the opportunity to critique our relationship with technology, but at the same time, there might be new affordances of beauty that only that machine, when it fails, can express. I've been thinking about the affordances of failure, inspired by reading across several epistemologies. Jack Halberstam's Low theory dismantles the logics of success and failure, the regimes of which dictate the way we currently live. Under certain circumstances, failing, losing, forgetting, unmaking, undoing, unbecoming, not knowing may in fact offer more creative, more cooperative, more surprising ways of being in the world. Halberstam's project critiques the intellectual culture of the dominant culture, in place of the all-encompassing and global theories that the university often encourages. Halberstam reminds us that Foucault exhorts his students to think about and turn to subjugated knowledges, namely, those forms of knowledge production that have been buried or masked in functional coherences or formalized systematizations. These forms of knowledge have not simply been lost or forgotten. They have been disqualified, rendered nonsensical or non-conceptual, or insufficiently elaborated. Subjectivity frames ontologies. Souza Santo, in The End of the Cognitive Empire, The Coming of Age of Epistemologies of the South, says that the South is a non-geographic space, a space of marginalized, post-colonial epistemologies. The epistemologies of the South concern the production and validation of knowledges anchored in experiences of resistance of all those social groups that have systematically suffered injustice, oppression, and destruction caused by capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. The vast and vastly diversified field of such experiences I designate as the anti-imperial South. Reading across epistemologies in my mind, I can think of Souza Santos's epistemologies of the South within the frame of Halberstamian, Foucaultian subjugated knowledges. Conversely, I can think of subjugated knowledges as belonging to the epistemological South. These discourses amplify what I feel, and my art practice helps me live it. I have been a noise that does not belong in the signal of music, a minority not factored into political determination, a subaltern my whole life. My practice both enacts and gives voice to my perspective, and my proposition is that my subjugated knowledge and my epistemology of the South can advocate for ways of hearing and seeing and being in the world that can also be beautiful. But it is weird, since these perspectives are exactly in the blind spots of the way the dominant culture teaches us to be in the world. My proposition to the world is, wouldn't you rather live in a world in which even this is possible? Because if I could do this, then surely you could do whatever you would like as well. I want to turn to introducing a remarkable friend of mine, Arnott Nongyao, a video artist from Thailand. He performs a film projector like a DJ plays records. In so doing, he produces sounds as well as images. We enjoy performing together. I was commissioned by the Hong Kong New Music Ensemble to create a piece involving the two of us. What I had planned for 2 years was this: a sound installation and a video installation accompanied, inhabited by an ensemble, would eventually telescope into a cadenza performed by me and Arnott, representing an embodied form of sound, a moving image, if you will. Me as sound and Arnott as moving image. This gesture is important to me symbolically in reversing the hyper-digitization of our lives with its contingent tendency to decouple art experience from our bodies, with the consequence that our physical trace of having lived is compromised. Working to reclaim the trace of having lived in Asian bodies such as ours also stands as a decolonizing gesture in music. One of the further unfortunate consequences of the pandemic was, as a casualty of the ongoing complexities of travel restrictions last year, Arnott was not able to join us in Hong Kong for the premiere. He contributed a video to stand as his proxy, a shadow of the physical presence I had hoped to curate. So, instead of the duo cadenza, towards the end of this hour-long piece, I had to perform alone with Arnott's film. His film is a close-up of a light bulb that flickers. I perform with a flashlight in one hand to extend that image into space as well as enliven it into the performative moment of the now in a simple, ever-changing counterpoint. The only sound is the sound of me smacking the shit out of my chest, my heartbeat on the outside. I am timing my hits so that at times it coincides with the flicker of the bulb in the film, but at other times my movements and stillness fudges that mapping. The moments of alignment imbues the image on the film with a real-time quality. It brings forth the recorded image into a liveliness in the now, but the fudging, the moments of misalignment, the quantity, duration, and pattern of those moments brings organic complexity in the relationship between my externalized heartbeat and the flickering bulb. In those moments, in those local moments of Brownian motion, if you will, is my aesthetic of time. These rhythms in the patterns of alignment and misalignment, finicky little eddies of time, are, for me, like the patterns of light and darkness and Markopolis' silence. I break and hack my body. video is quite dark, so it's kind of hard to see. I would like to conclude today's talk by showing you Prometheus Shashi Theater, a 3-channel video piece. It's 25 minutes long. I know some of what I've already shown you has been intense, so please be warned. I asked my collaborator, Xipeng Shen, to scream until she lost her voice while performing in the public space in front of an ancient theater in Shashi, China. What I document along with her performance is the accidental audience, some ignoring her, some taking selfies, some mimicking her, some videoing her on their iPhones. My collaborator did not initially know how to scream. She starts by singing, trying to control her voice. But with fatigue, her voice begins to fry, then later turns into a scream. I am interested in the scream as a transposition of my performance practice to another body, something like the converse of my scaling Santa Scala on my knees, and how our bodies are conditioned by time and fatigue. The public display of that vulnerability, the earnest physical change, is both the risk and truth that informs my performance practice, a kind of self-sacrifice. I am a shaman, the hunger artist. Furthermore, the scream is a visceral, non-semantic signifier. We can feel it, but lacking semantics, it is, as of yet, uncensorable. There's an old adage that says, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound, right? If no one hears it. What I wonder is if someone screams in a village, who listens? The sociological implications of that quandary also leads to the question, what does it take to affect social change? Right. I will play this video now. The most crude synchronization for this. Okay, thank you. Now we'll turn to questions. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for those who are able to stay here past our 1:30 time into the official 2 o'clock time that we have here. Ken, that was an incredibly wide-ranging exploration of your practice and your relationship to all of those other thinkers. I wonder if people have questions or comments or responses to what they've seen. I'll say 3 things really quickly to students. One, we've talked quite a bit about relationships between performance and video, including performances that might have been hard to watch, hard to feel, and hard to hear. And I think we have an expansion of that conception of a kind of endurance performance, whether starting at the beginning with Ken in the water and at the end here with this challenging performance with a collaborator. Secondly, interesting ways to think about your own video art project, about how you might mix sound and image. And third, with that, what it might be to use a camera in a way that makes clear your presence behind it, rather than one that tries to hide it. So just a few thoughts. You have your hand up or you're stretching? Okay, cool. Here's a question here. Does anyone else have a question? Raise your hand.
You mentioned the secret meridians.
Yes.
What makes that different from any pretty-looking coincidence? What is the What are the rules of that classification?
Oh, that I'm foregrounding my personal narrative, that I also had to be there as part of it. And I practice it so that I have become more sensitive to coincidences like that, because my experience is that most people just walk by.
I have a question. I think it might be helpful for some of the students who are working on their performance video, especially in this particular case. How do you negotiate between putting your own body at risk and subjecting a performer's body at risk, to a point where the voice is breaking, and maybe some students are thinking of applying a similar gesture, and I just want to get your sense or your ethics of how do you go about negotiating with the performer, the script, and also persuading and convincing her to perform, and what is the dynamics of doing so? Because holding your breath for the camera is very different from being choked to death.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's like Mishima, who did seppuku in front of the camera. All art, as a musician, most of my work requires collaborators, orchestra music, right? And I've learned that the greatest artistic risk I can take requires trust and commitment from my performers. So I do not work in the normative means of transportable orchestral music, right? Because there are things that are important to me as expression that requires closer collaboration with people. I do not think of instruments as instruments, I think of them as people. In this specific case, we are friends, and I told her about my piece called Prometheus. I showed a score of it. There was a red megaphone, and the score is that the performer screams until they lose their voice. And this is a piece that I have performed before, right? And she was interested in doing it herself, and she suggested that of the location, because she had been there and thought it would be a beautiful frame with the theater behind, but not accessing the actual stage, which is higher before it. But she also knew that there was this courtyard, which could be an interesting space to dialogue with the accidental audience. Right. So the preliminary step is to choose people you can trust, who understand my work and also offer their collaboration with me, because it does put them at risk. Absolutely. And so I thought of, Yoko Ono's work, where she cuts her hair, right? And then Marina Abramovich's work, where she has the audience come up and these kind of different negotiations of consent, right? And then there, both of the artists themselves become the vulnerable vehicle, right? And then that's what I did in my piece at the very beginning, right? And then there's also practice. I practiced to hold, and then I rehearsed with the percussionists, and initially they were playing too slow, right? And I had to tell them to stay at the tempo and these kind of tactical things as well. But it's about working with a community. Yeah.
Much. Yeah, here.
What I notice when people don't pay attention, because it's a guttural sound. It's a sound, it's not a cry. It wasn't a cry, people will react to that.
Well,
yes, it was helping.
Sure, there are different signifiers around
that
the
signifier.
thing. Yeah,
it's completely different.
If you point to someone and say like, "Help me" or whatever,
yes,
or
help me,
absolutely,
or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or a cry like a baby cry that the
Mm-hmm.
people they say that's when the sounds more profound that people can feel when they are sleeping.
You know,
the cry is very, very different between the sound produced like this
absolutely.
and a cry.
So I do not fault these people for not paying attention. But there was a point where the children were screaming back, and then there's all different kinds of interaction. People ignore, they walk, they watch, right? So that's interesting to me too. But my experience is going into different 7-Elevens, for example, and in the back there is a wall of refrigerators and there's a big hum. My experience is like talking to the people who work there, they don't hear it anymore. But this is a larger metaphor for how most things, many things in life, in our society, people filter out, right? This is the noise in the signal. I am that noise in the signal. We are. We all are.
Beautiful. And thank you for that question and that prompts that elaboration. Is there a last comment or question before we adjourn? All right. Well, thank you so much to Ken Ueno for sharing everything so beautifully today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Shannon.